Welcome to a new series I'm doing on world building mastery, where I'll teach you everything I have learned about world building over the past 10 years of my personal experience in the hobby. I was probably 11 or 12 when my brother actually introduced me to the concept, as he'd been trying it out. And although I don't think either of us had yet heard the term world building before, we understood the concept. He showed me his notebook where he had randomly started writing lore, and it seemed like such a cool idea that I just had to try it. For him it was a passing fad, but for me, it has been a lifelong obsession. I thought the best place to start this series on world building would be on, well, starting. So that's what this video will be about. How do you begin creating a new world building project? This is a new style of content for me, so let me know if you like it, and if you want to see more of it on this channel. Okay, so let's begin. There's a few problems that people will encounter when you're starting a new world building project, and I'm assuming you're in one of two positions when you're watching this video. Either you've barely done any world building at all before, perhaps none at all, and you're eager to try it for the first time. Or you have done a lot of world building, and you keep starting new projects, and you want to get better at doing so, and perhaps also more consistent in the projects that you're working on. Now, this video is for both of these people, since the process is largely the same either way. But it's also for people who have already got one main project that they're focusing on, but you feel like you're missing something, or you haven't gone about it in the way that you wanted to. Since, starting a project is largely the same as restarting a project, and it's largely the same process that will apply either way. So there's a few common problems that beginner world builders will face. These are people who have not done much world building before. It's too big and intimidating, or you feel like you need to be too original, or there's too much new stuff going on, which is understandable because it's very overwhelming trying to create a whole new world. So it's a lot of work to figure everything out. Or you might feel that you lack any kind of original concept or idea for your setting, like it's too similar to an existing setting, or you feel like you're just copying something, or you don't have any original ideas. Those are kind of the common problems that I've seen beginner world builders facing. Now there's a few common problems that I've seen experienced world builders facing, myself included. Starting too many new projects, so it's kind of like the analogy of half-built bridges. You know how if you're trying to cross a river, you need to build a bridge to cross the river. But if you just start, build one bridge half the way, and then you start on a new bridge and build that half the way, you're never going to get across the river. Whereas if you just kept on one bridge, it doesn't really matter which bridge, you would eventually get across the river. The opposite problem as well also exists, which is excessive attachment to an existing project and perfectionism. So you might have one project, one bridge that you're really obsessed with, but you're obsessed with that bridge to the point that you never start building new bridges, or you never start working on new projects, which can also be a problem because then you're actually limiting your own creativity. I'll talk more about how to address all of these problems as the video goes on, especially about how to keep yourself interested in one project for a longer period of time, because I think that's very important. And when you start a new world building project, you need to have that in mind, maybe. Not always, but generally. But yeah, world building must seem very complicated from the outside, but at its core it's actually very simple, and the simpler the better, really. The complexity of world building, which there is absolutely complexity, but it only emerges when you spend a lot of time logically extrapolating from a simple core. A lot of the problems that arise with beginner world builders and experienced world builders are that they didn't define the simple core concisely enough or specifically enough of their setting. If you just go into things with a vague idea and no plan, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by everything. You can still succeed that way, and if it comes naturally to you, then go ahead and do that. It will be a learning experience, but it's worth having some organization. Keep things organized. If you're intimidated to start your first world building project and you've never done one before, you need to just start. Keep things simple as you can possibly imagine. The complexity will come later. You just have to give it some time and some patience, but just start with a simple thing that you're interested in. So again, I'll get into all of those problems specifically in a moment. But section 2, how to actually start the world building project. So there's no objectively right or wrong ways to go about this, but if you aren't conscious of what you're doing, you will make mistakes that will hold you back. So it's kind of a case of learning the rules before you break the rules, because there's many different ways to world build. There's as many different ways as there are world builders, at least. But you can, if you hold yourself to a certain standard, it will actually be very helpful for you because it will keep you on the right track. You can, of course, be very disorganized and very, just do what you want, and in some ways that's better. But if you organize yourself, it will be more fruitful in the long term, I think. Now, the best place to begin a world building project is actually just anywhere, because a world is such an all-encompassing big thing that there's no fundamental place that's like inherent to the world that you have to start. Like, you don't have to start with politics, you don't have to start with resources, you don't have to start with a magic system. You can start anywhere and just work, and eventually everything will make sense. You're throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks, basically. You probably have a vague idea of the type of world that you want to create, and you might have some more specific ideas for like different aspects. Just throw them all at the wall, and things will stick. And like I say, if you just keep at it for a while, it will eventually start to make sense and form into a more coherent picture. I recommend playing into exactly the aspects of whatever setting which interest you the most, and logically extrapolating outwards from them. So you might take a core theme, like, for example, you might be very interested in, for example, emergency first responders. That's something I know some people are very interested in, like firefighters and etc. You could make a world building setting about that. You can make a world building setting focused on them. For example, you could make a kaiju setting. So you could have a setting where there's kaiju that attack the world, and there's a specific type of like emergency first responders that are the responders to kaiju attacks. And you could have a really interesting setting out of that. There's just an example of, you could start with a thing that interests you, maybe two things that interest you, like emergency first responders and kaiju, and you can just combine those and you get something really cool. And that's an aspect of kaiju settings that is often ignored, is the first responders. I don't know, it's usually about the kaiju themselves, but that's the kind of unspoken, underappreciated heroes. If you make a setting about that would be a really cool setting. I hope someone does that, but I'm not going to. Probably. Now, you need to be aware of top-down and bottom-up world building. So, if you've not heard these terms before, top-down world building is where you start with the macro scale, the big stuff. You start with the setting as a whole, the map, the timeline, the factions, and you kind of work your way down and start detailing this smaller area and this smaller thing, and you eventually get to the small scale stuff, like what life is like for the average person. The opposite of that is the bottom-up world building, where you start with something very, very specific, like the exact design of a boot that's worn by an adventurer somewhere. You can start with something small like that. You can start with specific design of this castle here, and you could just work upwards. So you can say, okay, well, why is the castle designed in that way? Oh, well, this, and this must have needed to happen, and you can extrapolate from that. This is somewhat similar to the gardener versus architect dilemma that exists in writing. And I think everyone's a bit of both. I suppose architect is more like top-down world building and gardener is more like bottom-up world building. And as I say, everyone will do a bit of both, and that's just natural. There's no right or wrong ways to go about this, but I think as you world build, you will figure out how your process works. Everyone has to kind of find their own process. If you do both and meet in the middle, I think that's the best way. That's what I try to do. Yeah, that's just something to be aware of. Now, when you're actually starting a world building project, again, you probably have a vague idea in mind. One of the things I like to do that I've started doing somewhat recently with new world building projects is I make a list of rules for myself, like rules and guidelines for the setting. So you need to decide upon a list of rules. I'm going to read you a list of rules for my own fantasy setting, just to give you an example. So I've got 6 rules here. First rule, the setting is extremely dark, and I'm giving myself permission to go wild with that. Second rule, humans in general will be well-meaning and have clear motivations and be somewhat redeemable. So I'm not depicting anyone as just pure evil, moustache-twirling villain, or at least no humans. There might be non-human characters who are like that. But that's the second rule. Third rule, every situation, no matter how dire, will always have some hope, however little it may be. So I'm never going to do the kind of Warhammer thing of, oh, it's all terrible and there's no way out and all hope is crushed. And, there's always going to be some hope, regardless of what it is or how scarce it might be. But there's always some kind of way of getting out of whatever horrible situation is happening. Rule number 4, everything can kill everything else. Even the strongest Varden or monster or whatever could be killed by a lucky bow shot from a skilled peasant. Overmatch will still happen, but everything has to have some weaknesses. Nothing is, power scaled to the point that it can't be killed by anything else. So rule number 5, the arcane must never become mundane. So magic will not be kind of deterministic and like a harp magic system, and it won't be known. There will still be limitations, obviously. It has to have limitations, but it won't be understood by people, which is a limitation in itself. But the whole point of it is that magic in this setting is very mysterious and kind of weird, and that's a rule I have with myself. So I can't be very definitive with how magic works in this setting, or at least not excessively so. Which means I'm limited in what I can do with it. And finally, rule number 6, nothing in the setting ever comes for free. Anything that grants any form of power must have a cost associated with it, and that cost should be roughly proportional to the power which it grants. So again, no hand-wavy and magic wand solutions to problems. If you have a disease or something and you want to cure yourself, you might need to, sacrifice a goat or, just some example like that. Anyway, those are some rules I made for my own fantasy setting. That should give you some inspiration for making a list of rules for your own setting. Core tenets and assumptions. It doesn't necessarily have to be rules as well. You could have, assumptions about the world or just the ways things will work. For example, you might have a rule like older things are generally more powerful in the setting. You might have a rule of energy is very, very abundant in the setting. I have that in my sci-fi setting where it's just kind of a rule that energy scarcity just doesn't really exist. Everyone has microfusion reactors and whatever. So energy is just very, very abundant. That's a rule. So it's worth doing that. It's worth also defining your kind of genre, your theme, or tone. So noble dark or grim dark or grim bright or whatever. It's worth, it can be worth doing that. It's not really necessary, but it can just give you a better sense of clarity of what you're kind of going for. And finally, it's worth describing some of the core kind of philosophical conflicts that you will have in the setting. This is where it gets interesting and kind of deep. So you could get, if you're interested in philosophy, you could take a philosopher who you're interested in. So, for example, Nietzsche. And you could write a setting about the conflict between master and slave morality, if that's something that you're into. I'm into that, so that's kind of something. That's the sort of thing I would do. But, whatever philosopher you're interested in or whatever. If you're not interested in philosophers, then just whatever you're interested in, whatever kind of moral conflict or whatever. Having something like that can also be worth doing in this kind of list of rules and guidelines that you make. Another point, which kind of ties in with the rules and things, is come up with a core concept, at least one core concept, preferably just one really, which ties the setting together and kind of gets people hooked and interested. So for example, in the fantasy setting that I just mentioned, I have biopunk medievalist knight mecha fighting monsters from hell. The harder your core concept goes, the better it will be for your setting, in my opinion. Just be as unapologetic as you can be. Everything you thought was cool when you're 12 is actually cool, so go wild with this. At the same time, you might want to have a deeper theme which lies at the core of the setting, in addition to the cool concept which ties things together and gets people hooked. And again, you can get philosophical with this. So, to give you an example, in Mortal Engines, which is one of my all-time favourite novels, Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve, the cool concept is attraction cities. These are giant moving cities on caterpillar tracks, and they use big mechanical jaws to consume and harvest resources from small cities. So it's kind of a town-eat-town food chain. It's known as municipal Darwinism. You need to go bonkers like that with the core concept. Or I guess you don't need to, but it's very good if you have something that's just unapologetically cool, unapologetically interesting. Again, anything you thought was cool when you were 12 is probably a good idea. But again, the thematic core of that idea could be something like resource scarcity or competition between humans or natural selection and Darwinism, mortality. There's a lot of different themes that you can go with in that idea. Civilizational decline as well. All of those are examples of thematic cores for a setting that complement the cool concept. So the better that the cool concept complements the thematic core of the setting, the more powerful your world building project will be. So those are just some things that you can do that will be very constructive in your the world building project over the long term. You come up with a list of rules to yourself, come up with some core concepts, like a core cool concept and a core kind of theme or thematic or philosophical concept. Also, immerse yourself in whatever you're world building about. So, for example, if you're, doing that emergency responders in a kaiju setting idea that I just mentioned, do a ton of research in how emergency responders operate, the logistics of it, and, how kaiju would affect the world. Research kaiju biology, watch YouTube videos on this. Just get addicted to it. The more that you think about it, the more creative you'll be. It's just fundamentally true. Which is why it's good to pick a core concept that you're already interested in. I mean, everyone has things that they're interested in. Unless you're really boring, but you wouldn't be watching this video if you were. So good on you. Now, there are some fundamental things that all world building projects will require. I recommend making a start on all of them before going deep into any of them. If your setting is kind of adjacent to our world, you don't have to worry about this quite so much. So, for example, with the kaiju setting, if it's set on Earth, like today, and kaiju just suddenly start appearing, you don't really need to worry about making different factions because, well, you just have the nations that exist today. But if you're working on a fantasy setting that's in a world completely unrelated to our own, you obviously need to go do a lot more work on factions and timeline and things. So that gives us into point 3, which is how to expand upon a project once you've started. So you should by now have made this whole document with the rules and with the core themes and the core ideas. But there's a few, again, fundamental things that all world-building projects will require. The first of these is a physical setting, which is just, the environment or the region where the setting takes place. So, for example, this could be the Milky Way galaxy, or it could be the Isles of Westeros, or the deserts of Arrakis, etc. Those are all just, classic examples. It's worth deciding on this immediately, perhaps even being the first thing that you decide upon, just to find a boundary for the setting. And knowing, the area you'll focus on, just know it immediately. There's not much to say about this. Yeah, if you don't define it, it can be a small region of the setting that you focus on. So, for example, the deserts of Arrakis, Dune, you can have it be focused on this one planet, but have this whole interstellar empire be implied. But, just have defined boundaries of the setting and know where you're working on. And then you can get into other stuff. Economics. So the most important thing to know about that, don't worry too much about economic systems, but which resources are scarce and which resources are abundant is the thing that's worth knowing. Then you can come up with factions. Always have more than one faction. I've made this mistake a lot, where you come up with this whole world building project, but you end up just making one faction that's like, oh, it's the Empire and they have this really cool army, but you don't have anyone for the army to fight, and that's a really boring setting. So don't do that. You can have a kind of a hegemonic power. That can still be interesting, but don't just have one nation. Have at least, at least a mix. A mix of factions. And there's ideologies and cultural differences. Again, this is, something that's a conflict-generating engine. Your world needs to be a conflict generation machine in order for it to be interesting. But yeah, culture, what beliefs do people hold about the world? That's probably the most important question to begin with. And then, of course, technologies, ways people have of affecting the world. How can people affect the world? So what do people believe about the world, and how can they affect the world? And what do they want from the world? Those are all good questions to ask. And eventually you can come up with things like history, a timeline, a map, etc. Let me know if you want to create if you want me to create a checklist or like a questions list for this. Let me know. I can go into this in more detail there. Now, of course, all of these things will influence one another. So, for example, resources will influence culture, and culture will influence technology, and technology will influence resources. So, you might have a world where the spice melange is really scarce, And that has an influence on culture because the people who use the spice are like the rich and the wealthy, and it's kind of that influences their technology because then the people who use the spice have an incentive to make sure there's no artificial intelligence, and that influences the technology. And because there's no artificial intelligence, people are kind of forced to mine spice in certain ways. You get the point. Naturally, as I say, this will require a holistic approach, so you can't really introduce anything into the setting without considering how it will impact the setting as a whole. I'm trying to think of an example for this. Let's just go classic example. If you introduce guns into a fantasy setting, this is a whole can of worms because everyone knows once you introduce guns, you show someone in a medieval fantasy setting with a gun, it's like it's a whole can of worms. It's like, oh no, how did he get the gun? Because that's going to impact the setting as a whole. If you just show them with the gun, but then don't show them again or mention them again, it's a problem because people are going to wonder about that. Like, why isn't everyone using guns? Similar with technology in like Star Trek and things. If you have like replicators that can just make everything, and you have teleporters or transporters that can just transport things, why aren't they using that to just make bombs and then teleport them on their enemies and just solve every problem that way? Like there's so many. You have to think about how people will apply things. So anything you introduce in the world has to be considered like that, which can be very overwhelming and intimidating. But the good thing about this is that it lends itself to a very kind of disparate work process, which comes naturally to most of us world builders, which is where you just sort of randomly work on everything at once. You randomly work a little bit on the timeline, and then a little bit on the technology, and a little bit on the culture, and you just keep working like that. That can be very fruitful. Alternatively, if you aren't like that, you can do the opposite, where you hyper-focus on one specific aspect of the setting, so for example, technology, and then you later extrapolate everything else out from that. I've done that a little bit. But be aware that this approach can lead to a setting that's very kind of monotone, so it's kind of a single note thing where everything feels like it's defined by this one technology thing. So it's worth just, throwing in a few wildcards, spice things up. Just always a good idea in general, really. Finally, section 4, how to keep yourself interested in one project over a longer time period. So, keep things organized. A lot of us world builders, we tend to be very disparate, like I say, so we're kind of just doing everything everywhere. But it is useful to organize your world building and writing as best as you can. There are all sorts of online tools for this. I've never really used them or found them that helpful. I prefer to just organize things in my own way, so largely I just keep things in one huge Word document. I just kind of organize things that way. My main setting at the moment has a Word document which currently sits at almost 50,000 words, and I feel like it's barely anything. So, yeah, organize things however you want to, but just keep them organized in a way that makes sense to you. You can have an organized mess, but it has to be organized. Another point I want to make is don't be afraid to lose interest or just abandon projects sometimes. That's okay. Like, everyone does that. It's part of the creative process. So I give you permission to just randomly abandon projects, randomly start new ones, randomly return to old ones, abandon them again, etc. This will actually fuel your creativity in the long term, more so than forcing yourself to world build something you don't want to. You can't really force art. But yeah, if you just randomly start new projects where you have a concept that you're interested in, often what you'll find is that you have a main project and you'd end up stealing from your other projects to add to that main project. That's really, that's a good thing to do as well. Steal like an artist from other projects and also from your own. Introduce more stuff that you find interesting. Like I say, you probably have one or two main interests. You just, outside of world building, you probably have things that you're interested in or you just find interesting. So, again, emergency first responders is an example. Kaiju an example. Military technology might be an example. I mean, that's what it was for me. Just anything that you find interesting. Don't be afraid to change the lore or just randomly introduce something new. Think on a longer timeline. Ask yourself, what will this world building project look like in 10 years? Will you have abandoned it by then? Maybe, but maybe probably, but maybe not. And it's worth going into the world building project with the assumption that, okay, I might be doing this in the long term. So yeah, you can afford to spend a year or two just experimenting, figuring out what direction the setting will go in. Like I say, the more combined elements you find interesting, the more likely you are to stick to the project. So if you're interested in emergency first responders and kaiju, you can combine those and make a cool setting. If you're interested in military technology and space travel and, I don't know, magic, you can make a setting that combines all three of those things, and that could be a really cool setting. So just take things that you are interested in, which don't necessarily relate to one another, and make them relate to one another. And the more of those that you find interesting that you've added in, the more likely you are to stick to the project. Identify flaws with your own work and change things. So this is a problem I've run into. If your setting feels like it just lacks conflict, if it lacks conflicting factions and things, you can introduce things that will fix that problem. So you can introduce resource scarcity, you can introduce ideological differences, you can introduce different factions of competition. Similarly, if you feel like your setting lacks flavor, like it's too generic and monotone, take a trope and subvert it. So come up with an original take on a classic concept. Maybe you take elves in fantasy and you come up with a really weird sort of version of them. I mean, I'm trying to do exactly that. Alternatively, you can come up with something entirely new and original if you feel like you can do that. But I think most new and original concepts are actually just new takes on classic concepts. Just come up with something original if you feel like your setting lacks flavor. Just give it some. Again, having an interplay of seemingly unrelated concepts that you just tie together and make the same, that usually leads you to creating new stuff. And finally, share your work. This is pretty generic advice, but it's good advice, so I'm going to tell you. Discuss with other world builders, discuss with friends, family, just get feedback on your work, talk about it, make it your whole personality, be obsessive about it, just talk to people about your fantasy map, get feedback, write short stories. My mission is to create the best environment on the internet for people to do exactly this. That's what I want to achieve. So, that's basically it. That's basically all the advice I have. I hope this video has been helpful. If it has, please go ahead and check out the description below. You can see my world building mastery community, where you should be able to join. I'm making a full course on world building, and that will be posted there soon when it's done. And again, I want to build a community of talented world builders and writers, from whom the next generation of great artists of our generation will be born. So that's the mission statement of World Building Mastery. In any case, thanks for watching, and I'll have more content to come on this channel soon. Bye!